what is an Asian and what is an Asian Canadian? And rather than sort of just assuming that we know what that is, I mean, I don't go around saying, hey, I'm Asian, and I don't go around saying I'm Asian Canadian either. It's actually one of those categories that virtually no one uses. And yet, Toronto is going to launch a program called Asian Canadian Studies. UBC is going to launch a program called Asian Canadian Studies. So one of the questions is, what is that? You know, we think, I think most of us know what Asia is. But let me just, is Iraq part of Asia? Is Iran? We call it West Asia, Central Asia. Are they Asian? How about Kazakhstan? Generally, when people say Asia, what they mean are, it's kind of like Prince, the artist formerly known as Prince. For a while, he had these albums that didn't have any name. It was just the artist formerly known as Prince. Asians are the people formerly known as Orientals. And what that means, in some sense, is that it's people who were objects before, like an Oriental carpet, Oriental vase. Asians, as a category, within places like North America, Canada, the United States, Australia, are generally the people who used to be unwanted, used to be excluded, used to be, in fact, the people which Canada, Australia, United States, along the west coast of Canada, United States, and you could say along all of Australia, they were the people who were unwanted as the nation built. And so in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was an idea that Canada was a white Canada. And that two things had to happen for that to happen. One was you had to get rid of the people already here. And the people already here were Aboriginal, First Nations. They had to be put in reserves. They had to be put in residential schools. And also, ironically enough, Chinese. Eric mentioned before that Chinese built the railroad. We kind of say that all the time as if it doesn't mean anything. Oh yeah, they built the railroad. Why did they build the railroad? Don't you think it would have been easier to have like Irish build the railroad or something? But it wasn't, because the Chinese were already in British Columbia along with Aboriginal peoples. They were there before the railroad was built because they could get there easier by water. It's only after they built the railroad that then you could have people come on the railroad that the Chinese built, getting here in big numbers. Otherwise, you'd be walking across the Rockies, not an easy thing. Right? And so one of the things to remember is the Chinese were here early. We have this idea that Asians are latecomers or Chinese are latecomers. You know, where are you from? You know, and you say, oh, I was born in Vancouver. And it's like, no, where are you really from? Well, I guess I'm from China, right? Even though maybe my great-great-grandfather came from China. But you're never really Canadian. And that is the result, in some sense, of a myth of Canada, that this is really about white people. And who are white? Those who came from Europe. And it doesn't matter how light your skin is if you came from Japan or Korea, you're still not white. And so why I bring all this up during Asian Heritage Month is that the idea of Asians and Asian Canadians is in fact really the outgrowth of this idea that the people who were formerly known as Orientals, those who were kept out, those who suffered racism, those who were segregated, those who couldn't vote, those who, Chinese, Japanese, other, they couldn't vote until 1947. In fact, Japanese Canadians couldn't vote until 1949. Before 1967, our laws didn't allow people from Asia to come in large numbers. That's one of the reasons why there's this new Canada that surrounds us in our major cities. So the numbers, again, that Eric quoted, that there are, in fact, 8% of Canada is now Asian. Well, the reason why it was artificially kept lower than that was because we had basically racialized immigration laws. Before 1967, if you came from Asia, you couldn't get in. It's only after 67. So really, that's only about 45 years ago. Right? In fact, it's the same age as me. Now, why I bring all this up is it's one of the contexts for why right now there's so much interest in Asian Canadians. But we have to be very careful with that interest, because that interest is in some sense sparked by a new reality in Canada, a new set of populations, the fact that our cities are changing. But 96% of visible minorities go to the major cities of Canada. And if you think about that for a sec, most of the people who are non-white are in cities. So the cities have changed. The majority of those we think of automatically as knowing, we know what an Asian is, the majority of those are either from China or South Asia. But recently, one of the fastest growing groups are from the Philippines. And so what we're seeing is these changes to what Asia is. If you're in Asia, nobody says, I'm Asian. They say where they're from, they say, I'm Taiwanese, or I'm this. So Asia as a category itself over there and here is not a stable category. I bring all this up because it really is something that's important for us to remember, because if we want to think about what's going on here in Canada, it's both a new thing, these demographic changes that have occurred recently, as well as something that was there long ago. The Chinese were here, as I said, before the railroad. And why I think this is important politically is that's what Asian Canadian studies to me is. We're going to start having community engagements and discussions, starting basically in this fall, talking about what we want to do to have a political project that is called Asian Canadian Studies. In other words, we're going to be studying something, but what does that mean? What does it mean to take young people out and have them think about what it is to be Asian or Asian Canadian? Not giving them a definition that, in fact, we can't figure out because there is no there there. There's nothing there in the category that already defines itself. So that's a couple things. So let me talk about Chinese Canadian stories. One of the things that happened in 2006 with the apology for Chinese head tax was that the government decided, the federal government, to put some money towards a program sort of saying, sorry, we'll pay each of the few people who are still alive, out of the 96,000 head taxpayers originally, there's less than several hundred alive. So you couldn't really give it back to the people who paid. So let's create a program, pay $5 million, and just give it out. In some sense, a lot of people felt it was blood money and didn't really want it. But if you're going to have the money, you might as well use it for something good. And so we applied, and we said that we would try to help collect stories, information, all kinds of things. And we would try to talk not just about what was done to the Chinese with things like the head tax and exclusion, but we'd also try to illustrate what they were doing when they were in Canada throughout its history. So yeah, we know they built the railroad and they paid the head tax, but what else were they doing? And so if you actually look at this one map, which I will show up, hopefully people can see what's on this screen. This shows of the 36,000 Chinese who did come between 1910 and 1923, paying the head tax, which is equivalent to about a year's salary each, this is where they were heading. So this is before 1923 when the Chinese were excluded, where after 1923, between 1923 and 1947, virtually no Chinese were allowed into Canada. Where were they going? Well, they were going, as you can see, everywhere across Canada. Almost every small town. All the way to PEI, Nova Scotia. Why this is important is because it goes against the idea that the Chinese were either only in BC or that, quote, Asians were only in BC. They were, in fact, all the way across. They were an integral part, in other words, of the story of almost every small town. They would have owned a Chinese Canadian cafe or a restaurant or a grocery store. That's important because it's not just that we want to say that these individual stories are important. We tried to collect a lot. But they were also engaging with other people. And so Senator Lillian Dick of Saskatchewan, North Battleford, her father was a Chinese Canadian cafe owner and her mother was Cree. We may think, wow, what a strange, interesting story. It's not atypical. All across the country, there were many Chinese who intermarried with Aboriginal people. It's those kinds of stories that we often forget. In Montreal, there are many Chinese restaurants. And who ate at those Chinese restaurants? Well, we had Francophone customers, but also the restaurants were in the large Jewish quarter of Montreal. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, the president of the university, I was in graduate school at Princeton, the president of the university, Harold Shapiro, was from Montreal. And his family, a Jewish family from Montreal, owned a Chinese restaurant. He and his brother used to work as waiters in the Chinese restaurant. That's as much a part of our history, in other words, as the idea of two founding peoples, English and French. in adding others, we still haven't actually overturned the idea that the myth of a founding Canada of two European peoples is in fact such a problem for us moving forward. Because as much as Canada is changing right now demographically in our cities, if we cling to the idea that the Asians have come later, we reinforce, in fact, the white supremacist mythology that Canada only started with the people who arrived from Europe. That, in fact, when those first people getting off the train that the Chinese built in 1885 looked around, when they got off the train in Vancouver, they saw, what are all these natives and Chinese doing here? We got to get rid of them. And that's what happened. And that's the story we still actually live with, which is in trying to ethnically cleanse those people already here and creating a story in which that ethnic cleansing is forgotten. The phrase they used was white Canada forever, and that meant forever in the future, but also meant forever in the past. We had to clean up the history, ethnically cleanse, in fact, the very lands which now are being occupied by new settlers. And so we have to come up with a new history of Canada, one, in fact, where trans-Pacific and transatlantic migrants, as well as those people who lived here long ago, can get together, can live together, and share resources. And so I'll end with one thing, which was, I've been involved in the city of Vancouver. We have a dialogues project called the Dialogues Between First Nations, Urban Aboriginal, and Immigrant Communities. And one of the ideas that was really behind that was that new arrivals to Canada often don't know the story of First Nations and Aboriginal people. They get wrong ideas. They see, some of the long-term legacies of residential schooling and of the reserve system, and they go, well, what's wrong with those people? What they don't know is the story of what Canada has done to those people. And so one of the things we've been trying a lot to do is with films like Cedar and Bamboo that the Chinese Canadian Historical Society produced about engagements between Chinese and First Nations throughout the history of Canada, with also films and interviews with people like Elder Larry Grant of Musqueam, whose father was a Chinese farmer on Musqueam land, his mother was Musqueam. And in exploring those stories, in recuperating this alternative history of Canada, one of the things is we can provide another way of understanding our own history and our own future. And so as much as I think it's important to celebrate our heritage and celebrate things like the art that has come from places in Asia to here, and to celebrate also the new generations of Chinese and Japanese Canadian, Filipino Canadian, and Sri Lankan Canadians, and Pakistani Canadians, and all these places we assume we know what it is that they come from, this place called Asia. We actually have to remember that Asian Canadians are those people formerly known as Orientals, that Asian Canadians are in fact a political project of people getting together who are the result, you could say, of a long history of marginalization and white supremacy. And even if you just arrive, if you forget that history or don't know that history, then you end up replicating the very hierarchies that were produced 100 years ago to marginalize those people. So even if you are well off and you've come and gotten off the jet plane in Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal, there is a longer history of how First Nations and Aboriginal peoples have been dispossessed, of how earlier Chinese Canadians and Japanese Canadians were removed or excluded. And so those are the things I think that are a part of what we're doing here today and what the month, Asian Heritage Month, is about. That it's both a celebration of a history, but it's also a recognition and a reconciliation with the past that we really haven't dealt with as a nation. And so thank you for listening, letting me speak, as well as thank you for thinking a bit about some of the things I've talked about and what our history is and what our future is.